Well, earlier today in the city council chambers, something that thankfully does not happen all the time, a disruption that brought the proceedings to a brief halt. City Manager Peter Zanoni had just begun speaking about some airport improvements when this happened.
You know that COVID-19 has dramatically changed.
Oh, you, Peter.
Yep, that was an F-bomb that somebody directed toward the city manager, Peter Zanoni, and was picked up on the PA system. At this point, it's still unclear who actually unleashed that profanity, but City Secretary Rebecca Huerta jumped in to remind everyone with a microphone in front of them that they had to keep it on mute, and Zanoni says he is looking into the matter.